The blistering sun beat down mercilessly on the red canyon walls as Hope James staggered forward, her parched lips cracking with every labored breath. 3 days lost in the maze of Hell's Canyon with nothing but an empty canteen and the tattered remains of her once fine traveling dress. Idaho Territory, 1876. Hope had never intended to be here. The 24-year-old Boston schoolteacher had come west to start a new life in Lewiston, Idaho, after her father's passing left her with little more than a small inheritance, and a letter from her late aunt mentioning property in the Idaho Territory. The journey had been arduous, but Hope had maintained her resolve, even when the stagecoach dropped her in Lewiston with directions that proved woefully inadequate. Just head east along the Snake River Trail, the station manager had told her, pointing vaguely toward the rising sun. The James homestead should be about 8 miles out. Can't miss it. But miss it she had. And now, separated from her horse after it had been spooked by a rattlesnake, Hope found herself trapped in the deepest part of the canyon with the June sun climbing higher by the minute. "Water," she whispered, her voice a raspy echo against the canyon walls. "Please, God, water." Her vision blurred as she stumbled over loose rocks. The sound of her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything except the occasional screech of a circling hawk. Hope wondered if the bird was simply waiting for her to collapse. 20 miles away, Mason Parker adjusted his worn leather hat against the morning glare. At 30 years old, he had spent most of his life in these canyons, working as a cattle driver, occasional bounty hunter, and now as the owner of a modest ranch nestled in the hills above Lewiston. The drought had hit everyone hard this summer, forcing him to ride deeper into the canyon to check on the small springs that fed the lower pastures. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Chance, lifted its head suddenly, ears twitching forward. "What is it, boy?" Mason leaned forward in the saddle, following the horse's gaze toward a narrow side canyon. Something had caught the animal's attention, something out of place in this desolate landscape. Chance whinnied softly, pawing at the ground. "All right then," Mason muttered, turning the horse toward the opening. "Let's take a look." The side canyon was cooler, shaded by high walls that blocked the morning sun. Mason rode slowly, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip, a habit formed through years of caution. Bandits weren't uncommon in these parts, and neither were wild animals desperate for water. What he didn't expect to find was a woman's bonnet caught on a thorny mesquite bush. Mason dismounted, lifting the delicate item with calloused fingers. It was good quality. The kind city women wore, certainly not something that belonged out here. More concerning were the drops of dried blood on its brim. "Hello," he called, his deep voice echoing against the canyon walls. "Anyone out here?" Only silence answered, but Mason Parker wasn't a man to ignore his instincts. Someone was in trouble, and in this heat, trouble quickly turned deadly. He remounted Chance and followed the faint tracks leading deeper into the canyon, a woman's boot prints, he noted, small and getting more erratic with each passing yard. Whoever she was lost, disoriented, and heading away from water rather than toward it. "Come on, boy," he urged his horse forward. "We need to find her before the sun does." Hope no longer felt the pain in her feet. The rocks had cut through her thin-soled shoes hours ago, but now a strange numbness had settled over her entire body. Even the thirst had transformed from an agonizing need into a dull, distant ache. She knew enough about survival to recognize that this detachment was dangerous, a sign that her body was shutting down. Her thoughts drifted to her father's library back in Boston, to the leather-bound books she'd read about Western exploration. None had adequately described the crushing isolation of these canyons, how the vast emptiness seemed to swallow a person whole. A loose stone shifted beneath her foot, sending her tumbling down a small embankment. Hope didn't have the strength to break her fall. She landed hard, the impact driving what little air remained from her lungs. "Get up," she commanded herself, but her limbs refused to obey. The sky above her swirled in dizzying patterns of blue and white. "You must get up." But she couldn't. As consciousness began to slip away, Hope thought she heard hoofbeats like distant thunder. Probably just another hallucination, she decided, as darkness claimed her. Mason spotted her crumpled form in a small ravine, her blue dress stark against the red earth. He was off his horse in an instant, scrambling down the loose shale toward her. "Miss." He knelt beside her, gently turning her over. Her face was burned an angry red from the sun, lips cracked and bleeding. But she was breathing shallow, rapid breaths that spoke of severe dehydration. "Miss, can you hear me?" Mason cradled her head, lifting it slightly as he reached for his canteen. Hope's eyelids fluttered open at the touch of something cool against her lips. Water blessed, life-giving water. She drank greedily until a strong hand pulled the canteen away. "Easy now," a deep voice cautioned. "Too much too quick will make you sick." Hope struggled to focus on the face above her, a man's face, tanned and weathered beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Blue eyes, startlingly bright against his sun-darkened skin, watched her with concern. "Who?" She managed to rasp. "Name's Mason Parker," he said, allowing her another small sip of water. "I ranch about 20 miles west of here. Found your bonnet back a ways and followed your trail." Hope tried to sit up but found herself too weak. Mason's arm slid behind her shoulders, supporting her. "Hope," she whispered. "Hope James." "Well, Miss James, you picked about the worst place in all of Idaho to get yourself lost." Despite his words, his tone was gentle. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here alone?" Hope attempted to explain about her aunt's property, the stagecoach, and her spooked horse, but the words came out disjointed and confused. Mason listened patiently, continuing to give her small sips of water. "The James homestead?" he finally asked when she'd finished her broken narrative. "Alice James's place?" Hope nodded weakly. "My aunt. She died last winter." A flicker of recognition crossed Mason's face. "I knew Alice. Didn't know she had family back east." He studied Hope's face more carefully. "Though now that you mention it, there is a resemblance around the eyes." He glanced at the sun, now climbing toward its zenith. The temperature would soon be unbearable in the exposed canyon. "We need to get you to shade and more water," Mason decided. "Can you stand if I help you?" With his support, Hope managed to get to her feet, though her legs trembled violently beneath her. Mason assessed her condition with a practiced eye and made a quick decision. "I'm going to lift you onto my horse," he said. "You're in no condition to walk." Before Hope could protest, he had swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. The sudden movement sent the world spinning again, and she found herself clinging to the front of his worn leather vest. "Steady now," Mason murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he settled her onto his saddle. He mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist. "Lean back against me if you need to. It's about an hour to the nearest spring." Hope intended to maintain a proper distance, but as they began to move, her strength abandoned her completely. She sagged against his chest, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, mortified at her weakness. "Nothing to be sorry for," Mason replied, his voice a deep rumble she could feel through his chest. "Just rest. I've got you." As they rode, Hope drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them and the solid presence of the man behind her. Despite her dire situation, She felt strangely safer than she had felt since leaving Boston months ago. Mason guided Chance through the winding canyon with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and turn. His thoughts, however, were troubled as he felt the woman's slight frame shuddering against him. She was in bad shape, dangerously dehydrated and suffering from exposure. The nearest doctor was in Lewiston, a good day's ride from their current position. "There's a spring about 2 miles ahead," he said, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "Used to be a Nez Perce summer camp. The water there is good and cold, comes right out of the mountain." Hope stirred slightly at his words. Nez Perce. "Local tribe," Mason explained, adjusting his grip to keep her secure as they navigated a steep section. "They've been pushed onto reservations now, but they still have rights to some of their traditional hunting grounds. Good people, for the most part. You know them." Hope's voice was slightly stronger now, curiosity apparently overcoming her exhaustion. Mason nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Learned tracking from a Nez Perce man named Joseph when I first came to Idaho. He taught me how to read the land, find water, survive out here." He paused, memories surfacing. "Saved my life more than once." Hope wanted to ask more, but weariness overtook her again. She closed her eyes, lulled by the steady gait of the horse and the rhythmic sound of Mason's heartbeat against her ear. The spring appeared as Mason had described, a small pool of crystal-clear water bubbling from a crack in the canyon wall, surrounded by a patch of greenery that stood in stark contrast to the arid landscape around it. He helped Hope dismount, supporting most of her weight as he guided her to a flat rock beside the water. "Drink slowly," he instructed, filling his canteen and handing it to her. "Then we'll see about cleaning up those cuts." Hope obeyed, savoring the cold, sweet water. As her mind cleared, she became more aware of her surroundings and of her disheveled appearance. Her once neat traveling dress was torn and filthy, her hair had fallen completely from its pins, and she could feel the heat of sunburn on her face and neck. "How long were you out there?" Mason asked as he dampened a clean bandana and began to gently clean a cut on her forearm. 3 days, I think," Hope replied, wincing slightly at his touch. "After my horse ran off, I tried to follow the trail back to town, but I must have taken a wrong turn." Mason's expression darkened. "You're lucky to be alive. Another day out there." He didn't finish the thought. "I know," Hope said softly. "Thank you for finding me." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Mason was the first to look away, clearing his throat as he returned to tending her injuries. "Your aunt's place isn't far from my ranch," he said, changing the subject. "It's good land, but it's been sitting empty since Alice passed. You planning to work it yourself?" Hope shook her head. "I don't know anything about ranching. I was a schoolteacher in Boston. I came because there was nowhere else for me to go after my father died." She looked down at her hands, embarrassed by how unprepared she must seem. "I thought I might sell the property." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's not an easy life out here, especially for a woman alone." He finished bandaging the worst of her cuts. "But Alice made it work. She was one of the toughest women I ever knew." "You knew her well?" Hope asked, curious about this aunt she had never met. A smile touched Mason's lips. "Everyone in these parts knew Alice James. She could outride most men, ran her place with an iron hand, and still found time to bake the best apple pie in the territory." He studied Hope's face. "She had your same determined look, though." Hope wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but it warmed something inside her to hear about her aunt. Her father had rarely spoken of his sister, their relationship strained by Alice's decision to move west decades ago. "We should rest here until the worst heat passes," Mason decided, looking at the sun now directly overhead. Then we'll head to my place. It's closer than town, and you need proper rest before making any decisions about what comes next." Hope wanted to protest, to insist that she couldn't possibly impose, or that propriety demanded she find other accommodations. But the practical reality of her situation silenced these objections. She was in no condition to travel far, and this stranger had already saved her life once. "Thank you," she said simply. Mason nodded, then busied himself tending to his horse and preparing a small meal from the provisions in his saddlebags. Hope watched him move with the efficient grace of a man accustomed to life outdoors. There was something compelling about his quiet confidence, so different from the polished manners of Boston gentlemen. As they shared a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and dried apples, Hope found herself studying Mason more carefully. He wasn't classically handsome, his features too weathered, his manner too direct for that, but there was an undeniable attractiveness to his strong profile and the intelligence behind those startlingly blue eyes. "You're staring, Miss James," Mason observed without looking up from his food. Heat that had nothing to do with the sun flooded Hope's cheeks. "I'm sorry, I was just thinking about what a mess you've gotten yourself into." There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Among other things," Hope admitted, "I'm wondering if I've made a terrible mistake coming west." Mason considered this as he took a drink from his canteen. "Most people who come out here wonder that at some point. The West has a way of testing folks, showing them what they're really made of." "And what if they discover they're not made of much at all?" Hope asked softly. Mason's gaze met hers, unexpectedly gentle. "I doubt that's true in your case, Miss James. Most people would have given up after the first day lost in that canyon. You kept going for 3. His words offered a strange comfort. Hope had never thought of herself as particularly strong, had, in fact, often been told by her father that she was too sensitive, too emotional for her own good. But she had survived, and perhaps that counted for something. The afternoon passed quietly as they rested in the shade, the temperature gradually becoming more bearable as the sun began its western descent. Hope dozed intermittently, her body demanding rest to recover from its ordeal. Each time she woke, she found Mason nearby, sometimes tending to his horse, sometimes simply watching the canyon, but always watchful. As the shadows lengthened, Mason announced it was time to move on. "We've got about 3 hours of daylight left. Should reach my place just before sunset if we push on." Hope felt stronger after rest and water, but Mason still insisted she ride in front of him, his arm secure around her waist as they navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. They emerged from the canyon into rolling grassland, and Hope caught her breath at the beauty of the landscape spread before them, golden grasses swaying in the evening breeze, purple mountains rising in the distance, the sky an impossible expanse of deepening blue. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Mason's voice was soft behind her. "This time of day, it almost makes you forget how harsh it can be." They crested a small rise, and Mason pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a sheltered valley below. "Parker Ranch," he said with a note of pride in his voice. "Not much compared to some of the big operations, but it's mine." Even from a distance, Hope could see it was a well-maintained property, a modest main house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, corrals, and pastures where cattle grazed. A small creek wound through the valley, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves flickered silver in the evening light. As they approached, a dog's bark announced their arrival. A large black and white border collie raced out to meet them, circling excitedly around the horse's legs. "That's Scout," Mason explained as the dog continued its enthusiastic greeting. "Best cattle dog in Idaho Territory, though you wouldn't know it from the way he's carrying on." A figure emerged from one of the outbuildings, an older man with iron-gray hair who shaded his eyes against the setting sun as he watched their approach. "That's Emmett," Mason said. "He helps out around the place. Been with me since I started the ranch." Emmett's weathered face registered surprise as they rode into the yard, and he saw Hope seated in front of Mason on the saddle. "Mr. Parker," he called, moving forward to take the horse's reins. "Didn't expect you back with company." "Found Miss James lost in the canyon," Mason explained as he dismounted, then reached up to help Hope down. "She's had a rough few days." Hope's legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Mason's hands tightened on her waist to steady her. "This is Miss Hope James," he told Emmett. "Alice James's niece from back east." Recognition flickered in the older man's eyes. "Alice's kin. Well, I'll be." He tipped his hat respectfully. "Sorry about your aunt, miss. She was a fine woman." "Thank you," Hope replied, trying to maintain her composure despite her exhaustion and the strange sensation of Mason's hand still at her waist. "Miss James will be staying with us tonight," Mason continued. "She needs rest and proper care before heading to her aunt's place." If Emmett found anything improper about this arrangement, he gave no indication. "I'll have Sarah make up the guest room," he said, turning toward the house. "Sarah?" Hope questioned quietly as Mason guided her toward the porch. "Emmett's wife," he explained. "They've been working for me since I bought this place 7 years ago. They're good people." The presence of a woman on the property eased some of Hope's concerns about propriety. Still, as Mason escorted her into the house, she couldn't help but feel acutely aware of the unusual circumstances that had thrown them together. The interior of the Parker home was unexpectedly comfortable, simple, but well furnished, with polished wood floors, sturdy furniture, and bookshelves that lined one wall of the main room. Hope's surprise must have shown on her face, for Mason smiled slightly as he guided her to a chair near the fireplace. "Did you expect a dirt floor and bearskins?" he asked, amusement evident in his tone. "I wasn't sure what to expect," Hope admitted. "I don't know much about how people live out here." "Some live rough," Mason acknowledged. "But I've always believed a man should have a proper home, especially if he plans to stay somewhere." Before Hope could respond to this, a small, energetic woman with silver-streaked dark hair bustled into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Land's sake, Emmett wasn't spinning tales after all," she exclaimed, hurrying forward to examine Hope with concern. "You poor dear, look at the state of you, lost in the canyon of all places. Miss James, this is Sarah," Mason introduced with a patient smile. "She'll help you get cleaned up and settled." Sarah tusked at Hope's sunburned face and bandaged arms. "A bath first, I think, then some of my willow bark tea for those burns, then food." She looked to Mason. "I've put water on to heat. Can you bring it up when it's ready?" Mason nodded, then turned to Hope. "You're in good hands now, Miss James. Sarah will take care of everything you need." Hope found herself reluctant to see him go, which was ridiculous considering they'd met only hours ago. "Thank you again, Mr. Parker, for everything." Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that caught her off guard. "Get some rest, Miss James. We'll talk more in the morning." With that, he left her in Sarah's capable hands. The older woman helped Hope upstairs to a small but comfortable bedroom, then set about preparing a bath in an adjoining washroom. When Mason arrived with buckets of hot water, he kept his eyes averted, speaking only briefly to Sarah before departing again. The bath was bliss beyond description. Hope sank into the warm water with a sigh that came from her very soul, feeling the grime and fear of the past 3 days begin to wash away. Sarah had added something aromatic to the water, lavender, Hope thought, and the scent worked to soothe her frayed nerves. "Your dress is beyond saving, I'm afraid," Sarah said as she helped Hope wash her tangled hair. "But I've laid out one of my daughter's old dresses. She's married and living in Boys now, but she left some things behind. It might be a bit large on you, but it'll do until we can get to your belongings." "My belongings," Hope murmured, suddenly remembering. "They were with my horse when it ran off. Everything I brought from Boston." "Don't you worry about that now," Sarah soothed. "Mr. Parker knows every inch of this territory. If your horse is still out there, he'll find it. And if not, well, things can be replaced. You're alive, and that's what matters." Hope knew Sarah was right, but the thought of losing the few mementos she had brought of her old life, her mother's locket, her father's pocket watch, the family Bible with generations of names recorded inside, brought tears to her eyes. Sarah pretended not to notice, busying herself with hanging a towel near the tub. "Mr. Parker says you're Alice James's niece. That true?" Hope nodded, grateful for the change of subject. "Though I never met her. My father and she weren't close." Sarah said, a world of speculation in that single sound. Alice was a character, that's certain. Not everyone appreciated her forthright ways, but those who knew her valued her friendship. She helped Hope rinse the soap from her hair. She spoke of a brother back east sometimes, usually when she'd had a glass or two of her elderberry wine. "She did?" Hope perked up at this information. "What did she say about him?" Sarah's expression grew diplomatic. "That he was as stubborn as she was, but without the sense to admit when he was wrong." She patted Hope's shoulder. "Family's complicated, dear, even more so when there's half a continent between you." After her bath, dressed in the borrowed calico dress that hung somewhat loose on her slender frame, Hope felt almost human again. Sarah applied a soothing salve to her sunburned face and arms, then insisted she eat a hearty meal of venison stew, fresh bread, and stewed apples before retiring. "Mr. Parker asked if you felt up to joining him for supper," Sarah said as she brushed Hope's damp hair. "But I told him you'd be better off eating up here and getting straight to bed." Part of Hope wished she'd had the opportunity to thank Mason again, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her now that she was clean and fed. By the time Sarah had helped her into bed and drawn the curtains against the last rays of the setting sun, Hope was already drifting into the deepest sleep she'd known in days. She dreamed of canyons that stretched endlessly, of a sun that burned without mercy, and of blue eyes that somehow held both storm and shelter within their depths. Morning came with the gentle sounds of a house awakening distant voices, the clatter of cookware, a dog barking somewhere outside. Hope opened her eyes to sunlight filtering through curtains she didn't recognize, momentarily disoriented until memory rushed back. The canyon. The rescue. Mason Parker. She sat up cautiously, expecting pain, but found herself feeling remarkably recovered. Her limbs were stiff, and her sunburn still stung, but the desperate weakness of the previous day had largely passed. On a chair beside the bed, she found clean clothes laid out, another dress, this one better fitting than yesterday's, along with necessary undergarments and a pair of soft leather shoes. A knock at the door preceded Sarah's entrance. The older woman beamed at seeing Hope awake and sitting up. "There you are, looking much better already," she declared, setting down a pitcher of water next to a wash basin on the dresser. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Much improved, thank you," Hope replied, surprised to find it was true. "Though I'm embarrassed to have caused so much trouble." Sarah waved away her concern. "Trouble would have been Mr. Parker finding you too late. This is just hospitality, and that's no trouble at all." She gestured to the clothes. "These should fit better. They belong to my niece who stayed with us last year." As Hope washed and dressed, Sarah filled her in on the morning's developments. "Mr. Parker rode out at first light with Emmett to look for your horse and belongings. Said he had a good idea where to start based on your description of where you lost it. Hope's heart lifted at this news. That's very kind of him. Kind isn't the word most folks would use for Mason Parker, Sarah remarked with a small smile. Determined, stubborn, fair, those fit better. But he's a good man underneath it all once you get past that reserved manner. Hope wondered at the woman's words as she followed her downstairs to the kitchen. What kind of man was Mason Parker, really? She knew only the basics, that he was a rancher who had saved her life, that he had known her aunt, that he lived in this surprisingly comfortable home with a middle-aged couple as his staff. Beyond that, he remained a mystery. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of coffee and fresh biscuits. Sarah insisted Hope eat a hearty breakfast, then suggested she might like to rest on the porch where she could enjoy the morning air. Just don't overdo it, she cautioned. Your body's been through an ordeal. It needs time to recover. The porch proved to be an ideal spot to convalesce. A comfortable rocking chair provided a view of the entire ranch, the neat corrals, the barn with its fresh paint, the bunkhouse where, Sarah had explained, the few additional hands stayed during busy seasons. Beyond the buildings stretched pastureland where cattle grazed contentedly. And beyond that, the foothills rose toward distant mountains. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that Hope had never experienced in Boston. She found herself breathing more deeply, as if her lungs craved the clear mountain air. Scout, the border collie, abandoned whatever ranch duties he'd been attending to and came to rest at Hope's feet, apparently having decided she needed guarding. The dog's company was oddly comforting as Hope found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. Just 1 week ago, she had been on a stagecoach, nervous but excited about starting a new chapter in her life. Now she sat recovering on a stranger's porch after nearly dying in a canyon. What would her father have made of this? The thought almost made her smile. Jonathan James would have been horrified by the impropriety of it all, yet secretly impressed by her survival. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. 2 riders were coming up the long drive to the ranch. Mason's tall figure, unmistakable even at a distance, with Emmett riding beside him. But what made Hope's heart leap was the sight of a 3rd horse being led behind them, a chestnut mare that she recognized immediately as the mount that had abandoned her in the canyon. Scout bounded off the porch, racing toward the returning men with enthusiastic barks. Hope rose more slowly, mindful of Sarah's admonition not to overexert herself, but unable to contain her eagerness to learn if they had recovered her belongings. Mason spotted her on the porch and lifted a hand in greeting. As they drew closer, Hope could see that the saddlebags on her horse appeared intact. Relief flooded through her. Perhaps she hadn't lost everything after all. "Good morning, Miss James," Mason called as he dismounted in the yard. "You're looking considerably better than yesterday." "Thanks to your hospitality," Hope replied, making her way carefully down the porch steps. "And you found my horse?" Mason nodded, handing the mare's reins to Emmett. "Found her about 5 miles from where you described, grazing pretty as you please by a stream. Your saddlebags are all there, though one of the straps was torn. We secured them as best we could." "I can't thank you enough," Hope said earnestly. "There are things in those bags that can't be replaced." "Family things," Mason guessed perceptively. Hope nodded. "Mementos, mostly. Nothing of real value except to me." Something in Mason's expression softened. "Those are the most valuable things of all, then." He gestured toward the house. "Would you like to check that everything's intact? Emmett can bring the bags to the porch." As Emmett unstrapped the saddlebags, Mason observed Hope with quiet attention. The transformation from the desperately ill woman he'd found in the canyon was remarkable. Clean and rested, her chestnut hair neatly braided and hanging over one shoulder. She looked like a different person, though her face and arms still bore the angry red marks of sunburn. "How are you feeling, truly?" he asked as they sat on the porch while Hope examined the contents of her saddlebags. "Much better," she assured him, relief evident as she located her mother's locket and father's watch, both undamaged. "I'm still a bit weak, but nothing like yesterday." Mason nodded, satisfied with her assessment. "Good. I was thinking that tomorrow, if you're up to it, we might ride to your aunt's property. It's only about 3 miles from here." Hope looked up from the Bible she had just extracted from her bag. "I would like that very much. I'm curious to see the place." "It's good land," Mason said, leaning back in his chair. "Alice ran about 60 head of cattle, kept a nice vegetable garden, even had a small orchard started." He hesitated, then added, "It needs work now, though. Been sitting empty for months." Hope closed the Bible, setting it carefully aside. "I should be honest, Mr. Parker. I know nothing about ranching or farming. I came west because I had nowhere else to go after my father died, not because I have any illusions about working the land myself." Mason studied her for a moment. "What did you do back in Boston?" "I was a schoolteacher," Hope replied. "I taught at a girls' seminary, literature, history, some mathematics." Mason seemed to consider this information. "Lewiston's growing. They might need teachers." Hope hadn't considered this possibility. "Do you think so?" "Worth asking," Mason shrugged. "Town's getting bigger every year with the gold strikes up north and the steamboat traffic on the Snake River." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah calling them to lunch. As they ate, Mason shared more information about the area, the seasonal rhythms, the challenges of ranching in the territory, the mix of people who had settled there over the years. Hope found herself fascinated, both by the details of this unfamiliar world and by the man describing it. Mason spoke with quiet authority, occasionally revealing flashes of dry humor that caught her by surprise. She began to understand Sarah's earlier assessment. Mason Parker was indeed reserved, but there was depth beneath that controlled exterior. After lunch, Mason excused himself to attend to ranch business, leaving Hope to rest through the afternoon heat. She dozed on the porch, lulled by the gentle motion of the rocking chair and the distant sounds of ranch work. When she woke, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Sarah was setting the table for supper when Hope came inside. "Feeling rested, dear?" "Good. Mr. Parker asked if you'd join him for supper tonight since you're feeling stronger." Hope felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness at this news. "Of course. Can I help with anything?" Sarah directed her to simple tasks, setting out glasses, folding napkins that wouldn't tax her recovering strength. As they worked, the older woman shared stories about the area and its inhabitants, including occasional anecdotes about Alice James. "Your aunt was one of the first women to own property outright in this part of the territory," Sarah told her. "Caused quite a stir when she first arrived. Some of the men tried to run her off, but Alice was stubborn as they come." "How did she end up here?" Hope asked, realizing how little she knew about her aunt's life. Sarah considered the question as she slid a pan of cornbread into the oven. "She came with her husband. Originally Thomas was his name. They started the ranch together, had about 10 good years. Then Thomas took sick with a fever one winter. Alice nursed him for weeks, but he passed anyway." Hope felt a pang of sympathy for the aunt she'd never known. "And she stayed, alone." "Wasn't alone for long," Sarah replied. "She hired hands, made the place work. Your aunt had a gift for getting the best out of people, expected a lot, but gave a lot in return." She glanced at Hope. "Mr. Parker worked for her when he first came to the territory. Did you know that?" Hope shook her head, surprised. "He didn't mention it." "He was just a boy then, barely 18, Sarah continued, stirring a pot of fragrant stew. Showed up at Alice's place looking for work, skinny as a rail but determined. Alice took one look at him and hired him on the spot. Said later, she recognized the same stubbornness in him that she had. Hope tried to imagine Mason as a young man, new to the territory and working for her formidable-sounding aunt. It created a strange connection between them that she hadn't anticipated. He worked for her 3 years before saving enough to start his own place, Sarah finished. They stayed friends, though. He checked on her regular, especially after she started slowing down these last few years. The back door opened then, and Mason himself entered, bringing with him the scent of outdoors leather, horses, and the distinctive smell of the pine soap Hope had noticed the men used. He had clearly cleaned up for supper, his dark hair still damp, his face freshly shaved. "Evening, ladies," he greeted them, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Something smells good." "Venison stew and cornbread," Sarah informed him. "Ready when you are." Dinner was served in the main room at a sturdy oak table. Emmett joined them, and the conversation flowed easily between the four of them. Hope found herself relaxing, drawn into stories about local characters and the challenges of the past winter. "The snow came early last year," Mason explained when Hope asked about seasonal patterns. "Cut off the high pastures by mid-October. We had to bring the cattle down earlier than usual, stretch the hay through a longer winter." "Is that normal?" Hope asked. Mason shook his head. "Nothing's normal when it comes to weather out here. You learn to expect the unexpected and prepare for the worst." "It's the preparing that matters," Emmett added. "Folks who don't plan ahead don't last long in these parts." Hope thought about her own lack of preparation, arriving in a strange territory with little knowledge and fewer skills. "I'm beginning to understand that." After dinner, Sarah and Emmett retired to their quarters behind the kitchen, leaving Hope and Mason alone in the main room. An awkward silence fell between them, both suddenly aware of their relatively short acquaintance. "Would you care to sit on the porch?" Mason finally suggested. "The evenings are pleasant this time of year." Hope nodded, relieved at the suggestion. The porch was indeed lovely in the evening light, with the setting sun painting the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the day's last light fade. "Sarah told me you worked for my aunt when you first came to Idaho," Hope said eventually. Mason nodded, his profile strong against the darkening sky. "Alice gave me my start. Taught me ranching, showed me what it takes to make a go of it out here." His voice held a note of respect. "She was a remarkable woman." "I wish I had known her," Hope admitted. "My father rarely spoke of her." "They were estranged," Mason guessed. "Yes." "I gather they disagreed about her decision to come west after her marriage. My father was very traditional, believed a woman's place was in the home, not running a ranch in the wilderness." Mason made a sound that might have been amusement. "Alice would have had some choice words about that. She believed people should be judged by their actions, not their gender or background." "A radical notion," Hope commented with a small smile. "Out here it's practical," Mason returned. "The West doesn't care much about where you came from or what's proper. What matters is whether you can do what needs doing when it needs to be done." Hope considered this perspective, so different from the rigid social structures of Boston society. And yet, there must still be rules, conventions. "Some," Mason acknowledged, "but they're simpler, more direct. A person's word is their bond. You help your neighbors because someday you'll need help yourself. You deal honestly with people or face the consequences." "It sounds clarifying," Hope said after a moment. Mason glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Most Easterners find it primitive." "I'm finding that I'm not a very good Easterner," Hope admitted. "I never quite fit in Boston society. Too bookish for the social set, too independent for the men seeking wives." The confession surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Mason. She hadn't intended to reveal so much of herself to this near stranger, yet something about the quiet evening and his attentive presence invited honesty. Mason was silent for a long moment. "Alice would have liked you," he finally said, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. The simple statement touched Hope unexpectedly deeply. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Hope found herself studying Mason's profile covertly, noting the strong line of his jaw, the slight crease between his brows that spoke of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, genuinely curious. "How did you build all this?" Mason seemed surprised by her interest, but began to explain how he had started with a small parcel of land and gradually expanded, weathering droughts, harsh winters, and fluctuating cattle prices. He spoke with quiet pride of the improvements he'd made, the breeding stock he'd carefully selected, the plans he had for future expansion. Hope listened intently, finding herself drawn into his vision. There was something compelling about a man who knew exactly what he wanted and worked steadily toward it. "And you did all this alone?" she asked when he paused. A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Not entirely alone. Emmett and Sarah have been with me from the beginning. I have seasonal hands for the busy times." He hesitated before adding, "I was engaged once about 4 years ago. Martha was a widow from Lewiston, had a young son." The revelation caught Hope off guard. "What happened?" she asked softly. Mason's gaze fixed on the distant mountains, now mere silhouettes against the night sky. "Cholera came through one summer. Hit the town hard. Martha and her boy both took sick." His voice remained steady, but Hope could hear the controlled pain beneath the words. "I was away at a cattle auction in Boise. By the time I got back, they were gone." "I'm so sorry," Hope said, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. Mason looked down at her hand resting on his forearm, then back to her face. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loss and resilience. "Life out here can be beautiful," he said quietly, "but it extracts a price. You need to be sure it's one you're willing to pay." Hope understood he wasn't just speaking of ranching now, but of staying in the territory at all. "I don't know yet what I want," she admitted. "Everything has happened so quickly." Mason nodded, accepting her uncertainty. "You don't need to decide tonight. Tomorrow we'll ride to your aunt's place. Seeing it might help clarify your thoughts." The next morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for their planned excursion. Hope felt almost fully recovered, though Sarah insisted on applying more salve to her sunburn before they departed. "The fresh air will do you good," the older woman declared as she helped Hope into a borrowed riding habit. "But mind you don't overexert yourself. You're still healing." Mason was waiting in the yard with 2 saddled horses, his own buckskin gelding, and a gentle-looking bay mare that Hope recognized as her recovered mount. "I thought you might prefer your own horse," he explained as he helped her mount. "She's rested and seems none the worse for her adventure." Hope patted the mare's neck affectionately. "Thank you. I'm glad she's all right." They rode at a leisurely pace, Mason clearly mindful of Hope's recent ordeal. The morning was glorious, the landscape awash in the golden light of early summer. Hope found herself entranced by the rolling hills, the distant blue mountains, and the endless sky above. "It's beautiful," she said, not for the first time since arriving in Idaho. Mason nodded, his expression softening as he surveyed the land he clearly loved. "This time of year, before the real heat sets in, it's at its best." As they crested a small rise, Mason pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a protected valley about half a mile ahead. That's the James place. Your aunt picked the location well sheltered from the worst winter winds, with good water access and plenty of grazing land around it. Hope felt a strange tightening in her chest as they approached. This was her inheritance, the reason she had traveled thousands of miles from everything familiar. Yet until this moment, it had been merely an abstraction, a destination, not a real place with its own history and character. The main house was smaller than Mason's but solidly built, with a covered porch wrapping around two sides. Several outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a workshop formed a rough semicircle around a central yard. An orchard of young fruit trees stood to one side, while a fenced garden plot, now overgrown with weeds, occupied a sunny spot near the house. Mason helped Hope dismount, then tied both horses to a hitching post that had seen better days. "It needs work," he acknowledged, noting her careful assessment of the property. "But the bones are good. Alice built things to last." Hope approached the house with a sense of trepidation, climbing the porch steps slowly. The boards creaked beneath her weight but felt solid. Mason produced a key from his pocket. "Alice gave me this years ago," he explained. "Asked me to check on the place occasionally if she was away." He hesitated, then offered her the key. "It's yours now, though." Hope took it, feeling the weight of the simple metal object in her palm. It represented a choice to claim this inheritance or to walk away from it. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a protesting groan of hinges in need of oil. Inside, the house was dim and musty from months of disuse, but Hope could immediately see that it had been a well-loved home. The main room held sturdy furniture draped with dust covers, bookshelves lined one wall, and colorful braided rugs softened the wooden floors. "She loved to read," Mason commented, noting Hope's interest in the bookshelves. "Used to order books from catalogs, have them shipped all the way from San Francisco." Hope moved further into the house, trailing her fingers along the surface of a solid oak table. "It feels like her," she murmured, though she had never met her aunt. "There's a presence here." Mason nodded in understanding. Alice had that effect. She filled a room even when she wasn't speaking. They moved through the house together, the kitchen with its large cast iron stove, a small study where account books still sat on a desk, two bedrooms at the back of the house. Everything was dusty but otherwise intact, as if Alice might return at any moment to resume her life. In the master bedroom, Hope found a framed daguerreotype on the dresser. She wiped away the dust with her sleeve to reveal the image of a handsome couple, a stern-faced man with a full beard and a woman whose piercing eyes and determined expression were startlingly familiar. "Is this Alice and Thomas?" Mason confirmed, looking over her shoulder at the image. "Taken in Lewiston about 20 years ago, I'd guess." Hope studied her aunt's face, seeing faint echoes of her own features, the same high cheekbones, the same slightly pointed chin. But it was the expression that struck her most: confident, uncompromising, alive with purpose. "She looks so sure of herself," Hope observed. "She was," Mason agreed. "Alice knew her own mind, never apologized for it either." They continued exploring, finding small treasures that offered glimpses into Alice's life: hand-stitched quilts in a cedar chest, letters bundled with faded ribbon, a collection of arrowheads displayed in a wooden case. In the study, Hope discovered a journal kept in her aunt's bold handwriting, chronicling years of ranch life with unflinching honesty. "May I?" she asked, holding up the journal. Mason nodded. "It's yours now, all of it." Hope slipped the journal into her satchel, determined to read it later. She wanted to understand this woman who shared her blood, but whose life had taken such a different path from her own. Outside, they inspected the outbuildings. The barn was in good repair, though empty of livestock. The workshop contained an impressive array of tools, many of them clearly sized for a woman's smaller hands. She did most repairs herself, Mason explained. Said she couldn't afford to wait for a man to show up when something broke. By midday, they had explored the entire property. Mason suggested they rest in the shade of the porch before starting back to his ranch. As they sat on the steps, sharing water and the lunch Sarah had packed for them, Hope found herself contemplating possibilities she hadn't considered before. What would it take, she asked carefully, to make this place viable again? Mason glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. You're thinking of staying, I'm thinking of considering it, Hope clarified. It feels wrong somehow to simply sell it without at least understanding what my aunt built here. Mason nodded slowly. It would take work. The fences need mending, the garden replanting, the orchard pruning. You'd need cattle, of course, and hands to help manage them. He hesitated, then added, but it could be done. The land is good, and Alice left everything in sound condition. I know nothing about cattle, Hope reminded him. You could learn, Mason said simply. Alice did, coming from back east with no more experience than you have. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Hope tried to imagine herself living in this house, working this land, building a life so different from anything she had known before. Would there be enough money from selling some of the land to fund the rest? She asked practically. Mason considered this. Possibly. Land prices are rising with the railroad coming closer. You might sell the north section, its good timber land, would fetch a fair price without compromising the ranch operations. Hope nodded, her mind working through the possibilities. And I could perhaps teach in Lewiston part-time, at least until the ranch was established again. You're serious about this, Mason realized, studying her face. Hope met his gaze directly. I'm serious about considering it. I came west looking for a fresh start. Perhaps this is it, just not in the way I initially imagined. Something shifted in Mason's expression, a warming, an opening. It won't be easy, he warned. Ranching never is, especially for someone on their own. I wouldn't necessarily be entirely on my own, Hope pointed out. There are neighbors, after all. The implication hung in the air between them. Mason's ranch was, after all, just 3 miles away. Yes, he agreed quietly. There are neighbors. They rode back to Mason's ranch in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Hope found herself seeing the landscape with new eyes, not just as beautiful scenery, but as land to be worked, managed, lived on. It was a profound shift in perspective. Back at the ranch, Sarah greeted them with eager questions about their visit to the James place. Hope shared her tentative thoughts about possibly staying, which clearly delighted the older woman. It would be wonderful to have another woman nearby, Sarah declared. And Alice would be pleased to know her niece was continuing what she started. That evening, after supper, Hope retreated to her room with her aunt's journal. For hours, she read by lamplight, absorbed in Alice's detailed accounts of ranch life, the triumphs and disasters, the daily challenges, the deep satisfaction she found in building something of her own. One passage in particular caught Hope's attention. T. says I am too stubborn for my own good. Perhaps he is right. But I have found that in this country, stubbornness is often the only thing standing between success and failure. When the blizzard comes, when the drought withers the grass, when the cattle sicken, it is stubbornness that sees one through. Not the petulant stubbornness of a child, but the steady determination to face each day's challenges and overcome them. I cannot imagine living any other way now. Hope closed the journal, her mind made up. She would stay, at least long enough to truly understand what Alice had built. She owed that much to the aunt she had never known and perhaps to herself as well. The next morning, she shared her decision with Mason over breakfast. "I want to try," she said simply. "I may fail, but I need to at least make the attempt." Mason nodded, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. Alice would approve. She always said trying and failing was better than never trying at all. "Will you help me?" Hope asked directly. "I'll need guidance, at least at first." "I will," Mason promised without hesitation. "Whatever you need." Over the following weeks, Hope's life took on a rhythm she could never have imagined in Boston. She divided her time between restoring her aunt's house to livability and learning the basics of ranch management under Mason's patient tutelage. She moved into the James place after the first week, once the house had been cleaned and basic repairs made. Mason rode over almost daily, showing her how to mend fences, maintain tools, and understand the rhythms of the land. Sarah visited often as well, helping Hope plant a kitchen garden and teaching her the domestic skills needed for self-sufficient ranch life. In Lewiston, Hope introduced herself to the town council and secured a position teaching 3 days a week at the small schoolhouse. The arrangement provided her with a modest income while she worked to restore the ranch. With Mason's help, she sold the north timber section of her property, using the proceeds to purchase a small starter herd of cattle and make necessary improvements to the ranch infrastructure. She hired 2 hands recommended by Mason-experienced cowboys, who treated her with respectful professionalism, despite their initial skepticism about working for a female rancher. Through it all, Mason was her constant support, teaching, advising, occasionally arguing when he thought she was making a mistake, but always respecting her right to make the final decisions about her property. Their relationship evolved into a partnership of sorts, built on growing mutual respect, and something deeper that neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and new challenges. Hope learned to prepare for winter, to ensure adequate hay supplies, to protect vulnerable livestock from early storms. The work was hard, often exhausting, but she found herself thriving in ways she never had in Boston. Teaching provided its own satisfactions. The children of Lewiston, a mix of settlers' offspring, Native American children from nearby reservations, and the sons and daughters of Chinese laborers brought diverse perspectives to her classroom. Hope found herself learning as much from them as they did from her. On a crisp October evening, Hope sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and gold. She heard the now familiar sound of Mason's horse approaching and smiled to herself. His visits were the highlight of her days, though she had been careful not to examine that fact too closely. "Evening, Miss James," he called as he rode into the yard. "Thought I'd check how that north fence is holding up after yesterday's wind." "The fence is fine, Mr. Parker," Hope returned with a smile, "but I welcome the company regardless." Mason dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post before joining her on the porch. Over the months, a comfortable familiarity had developed between them, yet there remained an awareness, a tension that neither seemed ready to address. "Beautiful evening," Mason observed, settling into the chair beside hers. "It is," Hope agreed. "I was just thinking how different my life is now from what I had imagined when I left Boston." "Regrets?" Mason asked quietly. Hope shook her head. "No, surprises certainly, challenges I never anticipated, but not regrets." She turned to look at him directly. "I feel more alive here than I ever did back east." Mason's blue eyes held hers for a long moment. "You've done remarkably well. Alice would be proud." "I hope so," Hope said softly. I feel her presence sometimes, especially in the house. As if she's watching over me, approving of some decisions, shaking her head at others. Mason chuckled. That sounds like Alice. They sat in companionable silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared. Hope had grown to appreciate these quiet moments between them, the unspoken understanding, the shared appreciation of the land they both loved. The Harvest Festival is next weekend in town, Mason said after a while. Thought you might like to attend. Hope glanced at him, surprised by what sounded suspiciously like a social invitation. I'd enjoy that. Good. Mason seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. I thought perhaps, that is, I'd be honored to escort you if you'd permit it. The formal phrasing made Hope smile. I would like that very much, Mr. Parker. Mason, he corrected gently. After all these months, I think we've earned the right to first names, don't you, Mason? Hope repeated, liking the feel of his name on her lips. And you must call me Hope. Hope, he said, his voice warming the simple syllable in a way that sent a pleasant shiver through her. It suits you. The Harvest Festival transformed Lewiston's Main Street into a riot of color and activity. Farmers and ranchers from miles around gathered to celebrate the season's bounty before the coming winter. Stalls displayed everything from preserves to handcrafts. Musicians played on a makeshift stage, and children darted through the crowds with boundless energy. Hope found herself enjoying the festival immensely, especially with Mason at her side. He seemed different in this social setting, more relaxed, quicker to smile, his natural reserve softened by the festive atmosphere. He introduced her to neighbors she hadn't yet met, guided her through the tradition of judging preserves and baked goods, and even persuaded her to join a lively Virginia reel, despite her protests about her rusty dancing skills. You're a natural, he assured her as they moved through the steps of the dance, his hand warm against hers. Just like everything else you've tackled since coming here. Hope laughed, flushed with exertion and pleasure. Hardly, but I'm learning to embrace new experiences. As evening fell, lanterns were lit throughout the town, casting a golden glow over the continuing celebrations. Mason purchased cups of hot spiced cider, and they found a quiet spot away from the main crowds to enjoy the beverage and rest their feet. Thank you for bringing me tonight, Hope said, warming her hands on the cup. It's been wonderful. Mason studied her face in the lantern light. You're becoming part of the community. People respect what you're doing with Alice's place. Our place, Hope corrected gently. I've come to think of it that way now. Mason's expression softened. Yes, your place. The music from the square changed to a slower tune, a waltz that floated on the evening air. Mason set down his empty cup and extended his hand to Hope. One more dance, he asked. Hope placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her back toward the square where couples were already moving in time to the music. Mason's arm slipped around her waist, holding her closer than the Virginia reel had required. Hope found herself acutely aware of his nearness, of the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her hand, of the faint scent of leather and pine that she had come to associate with him. They moved together with surprising grace, finding a natural rhythm as if they had danced together for years rather than minutes. Hope felt a sense of rightness, of belonging that transcended the simple act of dancing. Hope, Mason said softly, drawing her attention up to his face. These past months, he hesitated, seeming to search for words, an unusual circumstance for a man typically so direct. Yes, Hope encouraged gently. These past months have been the happiest I've known in years, Mason finished, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because of you. The simple honesty of his statement touched Hope deeply. For me as well, she admitted. I came west seeking a new beginning, but I found so much more than that." The music drew to a close, but neither of them moved to separate. Around them, other couples were drifting away, returning to the festivities, but Mason and Hope remained, caught in a moment that seemed to exist outside of time. "May I call on you properly?" Mason asked, his voice low and serious. "Not as a neighbor or advisor, but as a man who has come to care deeply for you." Hope felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Yes," she answered simply. "I would like that very much." The ride home was filled with a new awareness between them. Their conversation flowed as easily as always, but now there was an undercurrent and acknowledgement of feelings too long unspoken. At her door, Mason helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. Hope found herself reluctant for the evening to end, for this new understanding between them to be interrupted by separation. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "I could make coffee." Mason hesitated, glancing at the late hour. "People will talk." Hope smiled at his concern for her reputation. "People already talk, Mason. Two unmarried neighbors spending as much time together as we do. I'm certain the gossips of Lewiston have already had their say." A reluctant smile tugged at Mason's lips. "You're probably right." He glanced again at the sky, where a full moon illuminated the landscape almost as brightly as day. "But I should get back. Early start tomorrow. We're moving the herd to the lower pasture." Hope nodded, understanding the demands of ranch life. "Tomorrow, then, for supper perhaps." "I'd like that," Mason agreed. He hesitated, then leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. "Good night, Hope." The simple gesture left Hope's skin tingling long after Mason had ridden away. She touched the spot where his lips had brushed her cheek, a smile playing on her own lips as she entered the house. That night, as Hope prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 4 months ago, she had been lost and dying in a canyon, rescued by a stern-faced cowboy who seemed as unyielding as the landscape around him. Now that same man had become essential to her life in ways she had never anticipated. Was it possible to fall in love so quickly, so completely? Or had their feelings grown gradually over these months of working side by side, learning to trust and rely on each other? Hope wasn't sure, but she knew with absolute certainty that what she felt for Mason Parker was unlike anything she had experienced before. The next day dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn morning. Hope rose early, eager to complete her chores before Mason's evening visit. She fed the chickens she had acquired, checked on the small herd in the nearest pasture, and spent several hours in the classroom in town before returning to prepare for supper. Sarah had been teaching her to cook, and Hope took special care with the meal venison stew, fresh bread, and an apple pie made from the first harvest of her aunt's revived orchard. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, she found herself watching the road for the first sight of Mason's approach. When he finally appeared, Hope was struck anew by how the mere sight of him affected her, the quickening of her pulse, the sudden lightness in her chest. She stepped onto the porch to greet him, unable to contain her smile. "Right on time," she called as he dismounted. Mason secured his horse, then turned to face her with an answering smile. "Something smells delicious," he observed as he climbed the porch steps. "Apple pie," Hope told him. "From our trees." The simple possessive "our trees" seemed to please him. His eyes, usually so guarded, were warm as they met hers. The evening passed in comfortable companionship. They talked of ranch matters, of Hope's students, of plans for the coming winter. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation ran that new current of awareness, heightening every glance, every accidental touch. After supper, They moved to the porch to enjoy the crisp evening air. The sunset painted the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink, silhouetting the distant mountains. "I never tire of this view," Hope remarked, gesturing toward the landscape spread before them. "Nor I," Mason agreed, though when Hope glanced at him, she found him looking not at the sunset but at her. The intensity of his gaze brought warmth to her cheeks. "Mason," she began, suddenly uncertain how to express the feelings that had been building within her. He saved her from having to find the words by reaching out to take her hand in his. "Hope," he said, his voice deeper than usual, "I'm not a man given to flowery speech. But I need to tell you something plainly." Hope nodded, her heart suddenly racing. "Go on." "When I found you in that canyon, I had no idea you would come to mean so much to me," Mason continued. "I've watched you face challenges that would have defeated most people, seen you build a life here through sheer determination. You've brought something back to this valley that I didn't realize was missing until you arrived." Hope felt tears welling in her eyes at his words, so heartfelt despite his claim of not being eloquent. "That day in the canyon," she said softly, "you told me you found me before the sun did. But the truth is, you've been my sunshine every day since then, Mason. Your support, your patience, your belief in me when I doubted myself, they've been my constant light." Mason's grip on her hand tightened. "I love you, Hope James," he said simply. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that first day, watching you fight to survive despite everything." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Hope felt as if something inside her chest had broken open, releasing a flood of emotion too long contained. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much that it frightens me sometimes." Mason reached up to brush away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Why does it frighten you?" Hope leaned slightly into his touch. "Because I've never felt this way before. Because it makes everything else, this ranch, my teaching, this new life I'm building, seem incomplete without you in it." Mason's expression softened further. "Then perhaps we should do something about that." He hesitated, then slipped from his chair to kneel before her. "Hope James, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had sensed the conversation moving in this direction, the actual proposal still took Hope's breath away. For a moment, she could only stare at this strong, decent man kneeling before her, the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Yes," she finally managed, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Yes, Mason Parker, I will marry you." The smile that transformed Mason's usually serious face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He rose slightly, framing her face between his calloused hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Hope responded to the kiss with all the love that had been growing within her these past months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their eyes shining with shared emotion. "I don't have a ring yet," Mason apologized. "This wasn't exactly planned." Hope laughed softly. "I don't need a ring, just you." They married 2 weeks later in Lewiston's small church, with Sarah and Emmett standing as witnesses. Hope wore a simple ivory dress that Sarah had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Mason looked uncommonly handsome in his best clothes, his face solemn yet radiant as they spoke their vows. The entire community turned out for the celebration afterward, held at the Parker Ranch. There was music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army, as ranchers and townspeople alike came together to celebrate the union of two people who had already become important members of their community. As the festivities continued into the evening, Mason drew Hope aside for a moment of privacy. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Hope leaned into him, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "Completely," she assured him. "And you, more than I ever thought I could be again," Mason admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You've brought light back into my life, Hope Parker." The new name sent a thrill through Hope. "I like the sound of that," she murmured. "So do I," Mason agreed, "though I'm still getting used to the idea that you're really my wife." "We have a lifetime for that," Hope reminded him, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their shared home, they had decided to make the James Ranch their primary residence, while maintaining Mason's property as well. Hope looked up at the vast canopy of stars overhead. "You think she knows?" she asked softly. Mason didn't need to ask who she meant. "Alice, I'd like to think so. I think she'd be pleased to see her home filled with life again, to know that what she built will continue." Hope nodded, leaning against his solid strength. "I feel that too. As if somehow this was always meant to be, you finding me in that canyon, bringing me here, the two of us continuing what she started." Mason's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I'm just thankful I found you when I did." "Before the sun," Hope murmured, recalling those desperate moments when she had been certain she would die alone in the canyon. "Before the sun," Mason agreed, turning her gently to face him. "And every day since then, I've been grateful for that moment, for whatever instinct or fate led me to that particular canyon on that particular day." Hope raised her face to his, her heart full of love for this man who had become her partner in all things. "So have I," she whispered against his lips. "So have I." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The harsh Idaho winters tested their resilience, while the vibrant springs renewed their spirits. Together, they built something remarkable, a thriving ranch that combined Mason's practical experience with Hope's innovative ideas. Hope continued teaching in town, eventually establishing a proper school that welcomed children from all backgrounds. Mason expanded their cattle operation, earning a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock throughout the territory. Their family grew with the birth of their son, Thomas, named for Alice's husband, followed 2 years later by a daughter they called Alice, in honor of the remarkable woman whose legacy had brought them together. On warm summer evenings, they often sat together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard where Hope had once stood as a stranger, uncertain of her place in this wild, beautiful land. Mason would take her hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of deep love, and they would share quiet smiles that needed no words. Sometimes, Hope would think back to that desperate day in the canyon, to the moment when a stern-faced cowboy had appeared like a mirage to save her from certain death. How could she have known then that he was not just saving her life, but giving her a future beyond anything she could have imagined? "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked on one such evening, noticing her contemplative expression. Hope smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "About beginnings. About how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best ones if you just hold on long enough." Mason nodded in understanding. "About a woman lost in a canyon and the cowboy who found her before the sun did." "Yes," Hope agreed softly. "And about everything that came after all of this." She gestured to encompass their home, their children, the life they had built together. Mason lifted their joined hands to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "Best thing I ever did, riding into that canyon that day." "Best thing that ever happened to me, too," Hope replied, leaning against his shoulder as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in the same glorious colors that had marked the beginning of their journey together. And as darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast Idaho sky, Hope James Parker knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home, not just in this house or on this land, but in the heart of the man beside her, who had once found her when she was lost, and had been her steady companion ever since.